Welcome. So, we are into our last week of lectures. Everything's shifted this way for today. I kind of feel like we're off balance a little bit. Um, what's that? Oh, did somebody spill coffee? What's that recent? My last class. They didn't clean it up? Jerks. All right. So we're into the last week of classes. Today is ethics, and then Thursday is to the future. So we're kind of see what's happening after. We don't know what's happening after now, I suppose, but kind of going to talk a little bit about that. And today's lecture is all about ethics, and who has taken the CS ethics course here? One or other engineering ethics course. How about an ethics course in general here?
I think both of these are actually
Couple?
mentioned inside that class.
Yeah, I'm sure these are the clear classic ones. We'll talk about these papers that I just are there's a couple of situations that we're going to talk about that are taught in many other ethics type classes. As far as the Computer History Museum, I just talked to Ben about this. We're going to try to get a doodle poll out, hopefully today, trying to figure it out. I think it's going to happen midweek next week. So if you're already out of town, I apologize. Get to the Computer History Museum on your own because it's going to be cool. But we're going to try to get a time where it works for a lot of people, and we'll figure out how to get people down there. What's that? Well, I don't know yet. Next Wednesday, Thursday sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. So let's. So today we're going to talk about ethics, and I'm not going to give you a lot of stuff. Although there's a couple little reading things I'm going to have you do during the class that Ben handed out a little earlier. But I just wanted to talk about some of the ideas that people think about when as computer scientists or engineers or kind of just humans that use technology. What do we have to think about as far as ethics goes, and what kinds of big ideas kind of come out from that? So let's jump right in. Who likes Calvin and Hobbes? It's a great. That one thing about Calvin and Hobbes is the person who created Calvin and Hobbes hates. Bill Watterson hates it when you put things like this on slides because he doesn't want he's very tight about his stuff. But anyway, whatever. Fair use. There's an ethics problem. Fair use. Calvin, so you can read the little comic. So the question is, and Calvin deserves it, by the way. Every time he deserves it. Whatever he's doing, he deserves it. What do we mean when we talk about ethics? What are your big ideas? When I say we're going to talk about ethics today, what goes through your mind? Yeah, Calvin.
Kind of like rules that govern people's behavior.
Yeah.
So unwritten, maybe rules.
Rules that govern people's behavior. Yes, I like it. So, and they could be written or they could be unwritten. There's lots of written ethics rules out there. There's an entire committee on both the Senate and the House that actually has written rules about how do you actually do this, right? Sometimes morals are slightly different aspect of things where it might not be quite as well written or whatever. But ethics, you're right, don't have to necessarily be written down, but I would argue that we might want to write more of the things like, hey, you probably should behave in this way. And a lot of companies, by the way, also have that. What else? Rules that we should follow in what sense? Be more specific about that.
Specifically, in our interactions with other people, kind of has to do with maybe fairness or justice.
Yeah, I think interactions with other people, yeah, absolutely. Fairness and justice, I think we're kind of definitely getting there. Maybe I would kind of expand on that, maybe trampling on someone else's, whatever, their rights in some sense. That's kind of an ethics, issue. Or doing what's right and wrong, is another one. Yeah, sure.
The kind of concept of liability and whether or not you're requiring something to have too much of a stake in a situation that giving it more than it necessarily can handle, and there might be more in mind.
Okay, so liability. Can you give me an example of where that might come into be an issue?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be tech, by the way. It can be any kind of.
I guess when you sign up for a therapist, for example,
Uh-huh.
ethically you do accept the patient, there's that liability there.
Oh, right. Oh, I didn't thought about that. Yeah, that's a good example. There's a liability that goes along with a relationship, and that's an ethical like you have a liability ethically to treat that person in a certain way and give them good advice and not, and so on. I like that. What else? Ethics.
I
Jeremy?
think ethics is different from laws.
Ethics is different from laws. Yeah, I would. Yeah.
You know, the laws might say you're not supposed to do something, but it's not really ethical, or the opposite. We expect people to behave a certain way,
Yeah.
and not to
Yep.
yell at each other, even though there's no law against it.
Yep. This is a very good point, and I'm glad you brought up like the law versus ethics thing. So there's a lot of we're going to talk about some companies and some things that people have done out there that didn't break the law. Right now, you've heard about Facebook. I've got a couple things on Facebook in here, and Facebook is in the news for all sorts of like kind of quote shady sort of ethical things right now that they would argue, well, we're not breaking the law. And you may not like it so much, but we can do that, for instance, with your data. We can take your data and we can sell it to whoever we want, or we can show you videos that we think you will want to see and your friends won't want to see because we know something about your data. And those are questions about ethics fundamentally, about whether or not we Facebook as a company should be doing that or not, especially if they're not telling us about it. And there's some other things that have come up lately about that. So very good. Any other comments? Yeah.
I was gonna building on that. I feel like law tries its best to encode ethics, but it's necessarily coarser. Like it has to. You can't explain in detail like exactly all the possible edge cases. You
Yeah.
sort of say like we're just gonna go with this. This is like something that's easy to judge. It's some coarse
Yeah.
codified thing, and then like it might not line up all the time, but like we can't over specify it. I feel like it's something like that. It's some kind of a compromise. It doesn't perfectly map to ethics.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you have a good point that sometimes you can't codify everything, although we certainly try in lots of cases, right? And this is why we have lawyers who are going to argue one way or the other, and you have lawyers that can fundamentally disagree and kind of both be right in some sense, but then some judge has to make a decision, or a jury, and yeah, there's a lot of that. I guess, and this kind of goes to yours and Jeremy's point, that ethics or laws many times are based in ethics, and there are lots of laws that are there because of the ethical framework about them. So yeah, okay. So I think we are on the same, more or less the same page. Anybody else have any other comments? Okay. Well, so let's talk about ethics in computer science. And this is one of the Facebook things I was talking about. This is an XKCD comic, which you can read. So a few years ago, Facebook did they actually did an experiment where they showed people they basically showed people different news feeds based on what they perceived their mood to be, and they tried to assess how that news feed changed their moods. In other words, they were showing them things that were like depressing, and then trying to figure out if their posts later were about like being a little more depressed and this sort of thing. And Facebook was doing that, and they didn't tell anybody they were doing that, and they didn't get any approvals for that, and they didn't get, at least they didn't get the approvals from the people themselves. And that was a pretty big ethical question that they helped publish this in a paper and whatever. Now, by the way, you absolutely couldn't publish something like that coming from most universities these days. Who knows about the Stanford Prison Experiment? Hopefully all of you guys do. If you want, you can go 2 buildings over in the Jordan Hall and actually kind of walk roam the halls where supposedly that happened. The Stanford Prison Experiment was an unethical experiment where they pitted some group participants they put them as jailers, and they put other people as prisoners, and they kind of made them go against each other, and they did it without much oversight. In fact, without any oversight. And this led to many institutions. This kind of experiment led to many institutions, and by the way, it went horribly wrong, and there were lots of like bad things that happened with it. Nobody got hurt, as far as I can remember, but it was bad anyway. Not hurt physically, emotionally, who knows? But anyway, this led to the institutional review boards, which are now, if you want to do research, and I know Anna has probably dealt with these sorts of things, because you've done research, and you've done research, and I mean, you know about IRBs and whatever, and anybody who's done, I'm picking on you because you're a PhD student, that's why.
No.
Not because you, but if you've done any research, with people, you have to do these. You have to go through these IRB requirements, and it's actually a lot of paperwork and a lot of like taking little mini courses about what ethics you have to follow and about getting permission to do experiments and telling participants what they're what they're doing, and it's very interesting. And there are certain times where you can lie to participants about things and do it ethically still, as long as you give them information about it after the fact and so forth. But the people who did this study did not do any of that. They just kind of were thinking, and a lot of times you might think, hey, well, this is kind of a cool thing to maybe investigate. But you have to do it ethically, and this is one of the times where many people will agree that Facebook didn't do it ethically. So my question is, like, what other kinds of issues do computer scientists, engineers, scientists, etc., need to think about with regard to ethics specifically for technology? What kinds of things do you think? Like, what should we think about as far as like think big tech or companies that you may work for or have worked for? Yeah, come on.
I think like an interesting thing about the rise of AI is like the fact that it's going to replace a lot of like redundant jobs, and so like like maybe it is ethical, like maybe that's the way that technology advances, but like is it ethical to like remove those jobs without doing something about it?
This is a very good question. So there are something like I might have I don't think I'm off by an order of magnitude, but something like 15 million truck drivers in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
And something like that.
It's like the number one
And
profession.
it's the number one profession, and it's an important profession, and you don't need that much education to do it, and you don't. I mean, it's a lowish bar to get into it, and so forth. And when self-driving trucks, which by the way, Tesla's got a self-driving truck out there right now, that when those come into play, we might put 15 million people out of work, and what do we do about it?
Yeah.
That's a giant question as far as like AI and how jobs will get replaced. Now they say that teachers probably jobs won't get replaced quite as quickly, so I'm happy about that. And my wife is a psychotherapist, and that's like second, so I think we're okay for now. But or maybe it's first, I don't know. But yes, that's certainly a huge question in tech, as like tech is improving, and we're going to talk a little bit more about AI a little later too. Yeah, Frost.
When I think about it as security,
Oh, huge. Yeah.
like there's like obligations to like follow industry best practices in terms of how you secure your data, and even if you do that, you can still get hacked. But like there's all these examples of people who aren't even following really basic tenets that everybody knows you should do, and then there's also companies who gather way more data than they actually need to perform their function, and just even storing that data is itself like a huge liability, because you know you're inevitably going to get hacked, and then all that's going to get out there. Like I just got an email from Quora saying that they lost everything. I don't know who everyone else got that. And even the way they worded it, like I interned there, so I like the company, but they have this wording where like, you know, they say like personalization data was taken, and it's weasel words for personalization data. As far as I'm concerned, is every question and answer you've ever viewed and every query you've ever searched for, because I'm sure they're logging all of that.
Sure.
So like now that's all out there.
Yeah, they know what you're looking. They know what kinds of things you're looking at. Yeah, security is a huge example. I've got two examples that I just faced in the last couple of days. One which I think was good, one which wasn't so good. The wasn't so good one, I'll start with that one, was I just moved into a house where they have a security system, camera system, which itself is probably an issue. We'll get to that a little later too. But the security system, I can connect it to the internet, and of course I went and did all that. The last person who was there already had it set up, and it emails you whenever something happens on the system. It can do that, and they had set their email, and you have to send it from your email. So you have to give this system your like Gmail account information and password. And I went to do mine and whatever, and I'm changing the username and changing the password. And in the password field, it's got the little asterisks in there, just, I don't know what the password is, but there's a little eyeball next to it, and I click on the eyeball, and there's the person's password, right? Now, you probably shouldn't, that's probably not a good thing, right? You probably shouldn't have it quite that easy to like, somebody walks in your house and finds your password like on the system right there, you know? So wasn't the good one. Yeah, Anna, you had a question?
I was also going to say, like, in terms of like the design and how we're designing things. And so right now sometimes we don't know like the use of things or where those things. I mean, right now we design other technologies, and I'm just going to use an example that I have from my HCI class in the afternoon later on. But it's like, for example, WhatsApp.
Yeah, WhatsApp. Sure.
It began more like for conversation between friends and family, but in South America you use it for everything, and so it's like the way you have like events, you organize like a lot of interactions through WhatsApp and like for grandmothers. I mean, how it's changing the design and ethics, and who are you including in those designs? Or I'm trying to do some transcriptions of video recordings, and the transcriptions of teachers who work in the city are very good, but the ones from rural areas, they are not able to transcribe their accent.
Oh, right.
And so where are the limits and where we're setting those boundaries?
Yeah. I think this is a good point. You have to think about that when who you're building this technology for. Now, a lot of times, like with WhatsApp, they built it and they didn't know who was going to use it, but yes, it ended up being used by lots of people that they didn't necessarily expect. So, tough question. Yeah. Yeah.
I have more of a question in terms of if you do research and stuff like that, you know about IRBs and like having to like do ethical stuff.
Yeah.
But
you know about IRBs.
say like you go into like a company which is creating some sort of user interface and like doing all these different things, and like one time you're working on a project and you're like, oh, I'm just going to test this feature out, and it doesn't necessarily have these implications. But then the next day you're working on this sort of project, and it also just seems like, oh, I'm still just working on another feature. So where is like the training for people who aren't from a research background to be able to distinguish, oh, this is just like me testing a feature, and this is like something where it's more of a that sort of idea.
This is so you bring up a really good question of like who's doing the training, who's thinking about these things at company XYZ ABC, right? There are lots of people doing stuff that they don't even recognize that they've got issues ethically with that because they haven't thought about them. I think that's a huge point. Yeah, and I mean, especially if you're an intern or whatever, somebody says, go to this project, are you really going to say, well, I'm not sure that's ethically correct? Who knows? You might, but you may not as well. You may not as well. The other example I was going to use, which I think is a good example, and this goes to your point about like keeping things secure and so forth. First of all, I think we talked about this before. When you get, if you forget your password at a website, if you go to their website and it says, I forgot my password, they send you your password, that's bad news, right? Because it means they're keeping that password unencrypted. Now, for instance, the camera system has to keep it unencrypted because it's to log in, or at least it can encrypt it, but they should not be able to do that. There's the hashing we talked about where you can hash things in only one way and whatever. But I found one today where I forgot a password on a website, and what they did was they sent me a link that I clicked on to actually go and change it. But what they also did, and I hadn't seen this before, maybe you've seen it from other things, they also said, give us a passphrase that is a one-time use passphrase that they expected me to use once I got the email back at the site again. So it was kind of an extra level of security that I hadn't seen before, where I typed in this passphrase, they sent me an email that didn't have the passphrase in it, but then when I clicked on the link, I was expected to know the passphrase. So if anybody even got that email, grabbed that email, they couldn't even go log in because they don't know my passphrase. It was kind of a cool extra one that I hadn't seen. Yeah.
In the websites where if you change your password or something, it's like, oh, you can't use a password that you've used in like the last 5 years or whatever it is amongst your string of passwords. How do they remember? Is that also just a hash code?
Same thing's a hash. They're comparing the hash of your new password to the hash of the old password. So they don't necessarily know your old password. What annoys me, and this happened yesterday to me too, I was signing up for some other account and it said, you can't use any special characters in your password. I'm like, oh, come on, It's there's ridiculous rules like that.
Maximum length limits. Some banks are like you can't use more than 10 characters. Or something.
Yeah, maximum length limits. I mean, it's
systems. They're like database doesn't have room in the column or something for longer passwords.
Yeah, there's still a lot of people who aren't doing security right. So that's a very it's no wonder Quora and so forth get hacked. Anyway, okay, so those are some of the things we have to think about. You guys, I'm sure you come up with 1,000 other things that company A can think about. In fact, when you go to a company, I would urge you to maybe not like think about it right away. In fact, if you want, during an interview, it's not a bad idea, not a terrible question, is saying, hey, how does your company deal with security? How do you deal with, what are your ethical, thoughts on your company, especially if it is a company that's giant and does social media or whatever, and then those things come into play. Don't antagonize them, but, might want to ask about them. Okay. Speaking about big companies that have, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just one more question in terms of, for me right now, it's like, I feel like we are living in a world in which we are being overseen the whole time. I mean, like, I Google something and then I began getting an app. I'm like, okay, how am I able like to, where are the limits? And in terms of like, who I'm trusting in like if I check for a product and then like how prices change because there are sometimes that the prices change
Oh,
in one
that's
state
the
and
worst.
Other one, and
Yeah.
it's like who is behind? I mean, who can design? I mean, I really want to understand like what is behind the people who really are able like to put things together that work in that way. I mean, like,
It's an algorithm. Somebody tested this out and they said, oh, if Anna searches for some product and it's $10, and then she comes back an hour later and searches for it again and it's $11, she'll probably pay the $11. A, she either forgot that it was $10 before, or she really, really wants it and she's coming back. So yeah, I mean, there are ways to combat that. By the way, searching through the incognito in your browser, and I mean, there's ways to somehow do that. Although they can still get your IP address, and they can still. I mean, there are. This is such a good question, right? And it kind of goes to your data. I mean, what I hate is when they screw things up. Like I will go like buy a set of tires for my car, and then for the next 3 months they'll try to sell me tires for my car. I'll be like, I just bought them. Give me something else, you know? Sell me like tire spray to like keep it clean or something. But they don't do that. They always try to sell you the exact same thing you already bought, which I think is dumb. But oh well, I don't work there. Yeah.
People know you can usually go in and turn off like personalization, and like at least with Google you can make it so that the search results that you see are not personalized to you.
Yeah.
And like you can tell Facebook, you can tell Apple on your iPhone, you can basically go in and say, like, don't personalize anything. I just want to see the generic stuff, and the ads will just be terrible, but at least they won't be
capturing your data. Now, why do you think they did that? Like, why is that a thing?
Because it makes the most vocal critics happy, because like I can go in and do it now and I'll stop complaining. But like 99% of people are not going to do it.
I wasn't going to be that pessimistic about it, but I was saying I was going to say that they did that because lots of people did complain and said, "Hey, why are you storing my data?" And then they said, "Okay, here you can turn it off and whatever." You can also, by the way, go to I think it's Apple and download everything they know about you, more or less. I mean, I don't know everything, but it's kind of scary. They also will give you like a location data of where your phone was every minute of the day. Right? Which is kind of cool because you can go plot it on a map and go, oh, look where I've been. And then you go, wait a minute. Apple knows that I've been there too. So it's a little kind of, crazy. But yeah.
It kind of works with Google Photos as well. They kind of store your GPS coordinates. And
Yep.
once you search with like Google Photos having, like when I was in Los Angeles or something, they'll tell you these are the pictures that you...
From Los Angeles. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if you think about that, but your phone, which has GPS, every time you take a photo, that GPS coordinate gets logged right in the metadata of the photo. It's there. And if you post it on Instagram, somebody's going to know you were, at that taco stand in Los Angeles or whatever, right? Yeah.
Could companies just encrypt everything in such a way that only you can retrieve it? So that, I mean, wouldn't that be the most, then at least they sort of have it, but they can't read it.
Yeah, so this is a good question. Could companies encrypt some things such that only you could retrieve it? They would go out of business very quickly because they rely on that. Like lots of those companies would probably go out of business if they did that because they wouldn't be able to do that. But they could. Now, for instance, on my mail client, if I use Google, I can encrypt my mail messages using a self-encryption like message or whatever, and that will send it to Google, and then Google will not be able to read it. So you can do that, and there's public and private key cryptography, which we talked about, where you can do that. Google doesn't want you to do that, right? What they say is, oh, just use our website, and we encrypt it going from your computer to our servers, and then we'll encrypt it when we send it along to the next person. But they keep it unencrypted because they're mining it like crazy. So yeah, they probably could. Now, could they do it so you give them a key and they encrypt that? Probably. It might make things a little slower, or it might just not make it quite as efficient. But they certainly could.
Backups, I think I do a
Yeah.
backup, online backup. I think that's encrypted even to the backup company.
It should, yeah, and lots of backup services will guarantee that. They'll say we're encrypting it, so we don't even have access to it. But remember, Google's in the business of getting your data, so they're probably not going to do that without a fight. But they might, you could probably do it. Like I said, Google will not tell you how to use encryption keys on either end. They'll say it's possible, but we're not going to tell you how, because they don't really want everybody to be able to do it. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like at the same time, Google is using that data to make useful things for their clients.
True.
You know what I mean? Like recently, they came out with this like automated like email suggestion thing where you can like read email and then click on suggestion, and I found that very useful. It's really reduced the amount of time that I spend responding to emails, and it's like super accurate. So I feel like if everybody just like encrypted their messages so Google couldn't use it in their training algorithms, then
Yeah. How many years have you worked for Google now? No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. And you know what? This is exactly what companies will argue, and with a good reason. They'll say, look, if we weren't collecting your data, we wouldn't be able to give you good targeted ads, or we wouldn't be able to give you those features where we kind of can predict who you might want to reply to, or what, you know. They will say that a lot of that is important, and a lot of that is useful to you, and they might be right. And I'm not going to argue that they're not right. There's just some questions about whether it's your data or not, number one, and number two, you know, where's that line of where it's going to be useful to you and where they're overstepping their bounds and selling it to somebody else. But I think you've got a very good point, though. Pasha, yeah.
I think that's also at least part of the reason why like Apple's AI is worse than Google's AI, because they're at least trying to send less data to their own servers, and they try to keep it on your device, which means they can't do as much learning on these giant data sets. Like the thing you said about location, that actually doesn't leave the iPhone, as far as I'm aware.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
yeah.
I didn't realize that. Right.
So like they can't do as much learning on that. They have to do it on your device, and then they can't really test it on like, they can't be like, how does this perform for all of our users? They have to test it on like their own data, but they can't see everything.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
But I also feel like I feel like the email thing is useful but not essential. But then if you think about like data that's being collected from like a Fitbit, like those sorts of things, like you could like you could potentially like take that data and then like train I don't know if they're doing this now, but maybe sometime in the future, and then like train a model that will kind of predict like based on somebody's heart rate, like whether they're about to have like heart problems or a heart attack, and like that could literally save people's lives.
Absolutely. That could literally save people's lives, and that's a great way. But where is the line where now they say, oh, and by the way, we're also selling that data to your insurance company, right? Oh, Chris is probably gonna have a heart attack in the next 2 years. My insurance rates will go whoop, right through the roof, and but absolutely, it goes both ways, right? You can get benefits out of it, but you can also get very concerning things out of it when it comes down to that. But I think who owns your data and whether or not you can actually affect it or whatever. Speaking about the iPhones and things, some of your data, maybe it's the app you're using, but if I'm using Waze, for instance, right? Waze will tell me, go to it's the driving app. It's like Google Maps, except a little more information normally. But if I'm using that, it will sometimes say, we're updating your estimated time because there's some traffic up ahead. How do they know there's traffic up ahead? Well, because all the other phones up ahead have been sending back their data saying how fast they're going, and then they're collecting it. Now, they may anonymize it. They probably do. It's probably not, Firas is driving in the slow lane or whatever, right? It's somebody's driving in the slow lane or whatever, or too slow in the fast lane or whatever. But yeah. So no, I think your point is very well taken. That and I love the fact that we've got all these cool technologies. And if we did hammer down what data we get out there, we might feel a little bit happier about that, but we might not get some of those cool benefits. Very good point. And ethics there's some fine lines there. Yeah. There's a little video. I don't think I'm going to show it to you. I didn't think it was amazing, but this, did anybody recognize this comic on the left? Who's drawing that? It's a comic called PhD Comics. It's by, it's written by a guy who was actually in PhD at Stanford, and a lot of the comics, he does some videos and whatever. There's a lot of the comics are very Stanford specific. Like you can kind of tell, you're like, oh yeah, there's Stanford. But anyway, as far as your data goes, if you've signed the agreement that not one of you have ever read, that says that Facebook owns your data, they own your data, right? I mean, there's not much you can do about that, and the courts will probably back up Facebook when it comes down to it. Speaking of those things, did you know there's some of those agreements, they put Easter eggs in there, and one guy once read through a whole agreement. I don't know if he was bored or what, but all 37 pages are, and at the end it says, if you read through this, contact the company, there's a cash reward, right? And he contacted them and here's $1,000. They're the first person to ever do this, and whatever. So, I mean, it's a good reason to read those things, but then now they know one person read their whole agreement, right? The entire thing, but anyway, this Dilbert cartoon comic, I think is pretty good. I mean, customer data is an asset that you can sell. Now, is the phrase they go, if you're not paying for a product, you're the product. That's the way it goes, right? I mean, if you're not paying for something like Gmail, I've never paid one penny to Google for Gmail. That means that Gmail is not the product. I'm the product, right? They're mining all my emails for all different times I look for pet insurance, and I look for, whatever else, right? And they're taking that and they're going to send me ads and they're going to target that and so forth. So that is, the data is a big ethical kind of question. Okay, let's continue with our big companies kind of idea here. Like big companies, there's another Facebook comic, right? Do you know this comic? Or this cartoon, I should say? Yeah, Rocky and Bullwinkle, right? There's a new Rocky and Bullwinkle, which is out, but this is like an old comic, and Natasha and Boris are bad guys, and this was all during the Cold War, so, but anyway, Facebook has come under a lot of scrutiny for their behavior in the elections, and they're like, they sold lots and lots of ads to people who were trying to kind of unethically shift election type ideas, and this is still happening in the 2018 election. Probably it definitely happened in 2016, and Facebook got kind of they dragged Mark Zuckerberg up in front of Congress to talk about those sorts of ideas, and he basically said, "Hey, we sell ads, and we don't know what's happening with them and whatever." But he was a little more nice about that. But big companies, like, what responsibilities do the big companies have? It's a question. Like, what responsibilities do we talked about this a little bit? But you're Facebook, or you're the next Instagram, or you're the next Twitter, or whatever. What responsibilities do you have with the data and otherwise? Yeah.
I'm curious as to where the balance comes in between the companies, or like the people who are running the companies, and then their fiduciary responsibilities as opposed to their like public good responsibilities, I guess.
Yeah, so we live in a capitalist society. And we have companies like Facebook that have sold for billions of dollars, so they are owned publicly, and they have boards of directors that are publicly, and they have to follow some ethical rules. And in fact, if they're a company in California, they have other ethical rules they have to follow, and they also have other interesting rules, like there has to be so many females on their board of directors and things like that that are codified into kind of laws. But you're absolutely right, is like, who's the responsibility of Facebook is to their stockholders. Those are the people that are paying that are basically the ones who are going to buy and sell their stock and make it worth a company. So you have a good question, right? Like, where are those lines drawn?
I guess my question is, who is the person who decides where those lines are drawn?
Who is the person that decides? What do you guys think? Who decides where those lines are? The lines between, like, what you can and can't do in your company. Who decides those? It's either the government, it's the companies themselves. I mean, Google famously had a phrase in their company statement that was "do no harm." Don't be evil. Don't be evil. I mean, it's a little hard to decide what that is. So boards of directors can sometimes decide that. Companies will hire ethicists, by the way, to make these, people who have thought about these things, and will make calls on that. And if certainly lawyers make lots of decisions that are those sorts of things, so that keep the company from getting afoul of the law. But I mean, I guess I would argue that the users of Facebook, in some sense, make those decisions whether they want to or not. I mean, maybe if they don't care enough to be mad about it, then they've by default said it's okay. If they don't know about it. I mean, if they do know about it. Like, there's been so much news lately about how Facebook has allowed, the Russians to buy ads and target various demographics with misleading ads. If there's no outcry about it, then you kind of ended up deciding that it was that, unless you turn off Facebook, which is hard to do. Yeah.
I feel like how would Facebook even have known that was happening? How would they even have known, somebody from Russia bought an ad, they're trying to influence?
It's a good question. It's a good question. That's what Facebook says. They go, how do we know, right? And other people are saying, well, you could have asked them where they were from, or you could have said you could have had a little higher standard for giving out for selling those ads.
But at the same time, if you just use the metric of where they're from, I mean, my parents are from Russia. I get ads on Facebook, and then I go on Russian websites all the time, so I get ads from Facebook about that, and then some people just buy clothes and things from Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's hard. I think that's the answer, is that it's hard. And it maybe not. Maybe it's also, maybe we're all talking about something that we shouldn't, it's too bad that happens, right? I mean, maybe it's just in the interest of not what's the word I'm looking for? In the interest of not being against some particular, types of people, we should maybe just let them Facebook sell whatever ads. But other people would argue, no, look, you could have done a little bit of due diligence to try to figure out what those ads were and whether or not they were truthful or not. I think that's the other thing, Like if there's an ad that is blatantly lying about something, maybe Facebook should say, no, you're not allowed to put that on the air. And most television stations won't allow like fake ads in that sense to go on the air. I think the line is hard.
But I
But,
think that also
yeah.
a lot of the ads were like image based and like memes, and it's difficult to extract text from them.
Right, and this is why Facebook has a giant AI kind of department that's trying to do that sort of stuff too. That's not the only reason. They're trying to mine more of your data, but they're hopefully going to be able to use that for those sorts of things too. I think your point is well taken. Yeah.
I just had a question, like why do those guys assume that people are like so naive that they won't recognize that they are being targeted by the...
Well, there are a lot of people who are fooled by ads. I will leave it at that. I mean, I'm not saying there are a lot of people who aren't quite so smart out there. I'm just saying that a lot of people were fooled by ads. I've probably been fooled by lots of things before in the same vein that I didn't even realize. So you can say, look, everybody would recognize that, but a lot of people didn't recognize that, or they just kept hearing it again and again and again, and it kind of sunk in like, oh, something fishy's going on here. Yeah.
50% of the country is below average.
50% of the country's below average. All right. Yes, fair enough. All right, but anyway, again, big companies are, and that's the other thing. We're now in an age. Well, we're still in an age of giant companies. I mean, there are always the IBMs of the world and the GMs and big giant companies, but big tech companies that have more data than you can ever imagine, and they're using it for good and for evil in some cases. Okay, let's switch tacks a little bit, and let's not talk about like bad people necessarily. Let's just talk about bugs in software, because there's some ethical things that come out when we talk about bugs, and it may not be because of anybody being malicious. Okay, there are some ethical issues that can still come about. Bugs. There's a guy named Maurice Wilkes who said and this is a guy, he worked on the EDSAC, which is one of the computers back from the 40s, 50s? 50s, I guess.
The von Neumann architecture was proposed in the draft report on the EDSAC, so 1949.
We're talking like late 40s sort of time frame. He said, as soon as we started programming, we found, to our surprise, they didn't necessarily predict this, that it wasn't easy to get programs right as we had thought. This is like the first people programming, oh man, I have a bug. Oh, this is harder than we thought, right? Debugging had to be discovered. Like they didn't quite think about that through. I can remember the exact instant when I realized that a large part of my life from then on was going to be spent finding mistakes in my own programs. Okay, that had to be a terrible discovery. Although maybe he just took it for like, oh, it's a challenge to find all these bugs. But that's what he said. Department of Defense has thought about this stuff because they're trying to write programs that will fight wars and things, and they want to do it right. And they said, simply because of its inevitable large size, the software capable of performing the battle management task for strategic defense will contain errors. Will contain errors. All systems of useful complexity contain software errors. What they're saying is you can't debug a program fully. You're going to end up with errors in it, right? And then, even this is back in the 60s still, although programming techniques have improved immensely since the early days, the process of finding and correcting errors in programming known graphically if inelegantly as debugging still remains most difficult, confused, and unsatisfactory. Although we are happy to pay lip service to the adage that to err is human, most of us like to make a small private reservation about our own performance on special occasions when we really try. In other words, they're saying, look, you might think you're a good programmer and not going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes, right? It's somewhat deflating to be shown publicly and incontrovertibly by a machine that even when we do try, we in fact make just as many mistakes as other people. If your pride cannot recover from this blow, you will never be a make programmer. In other words, get used to it, you're going to be debugging. All right? That's the way it goes. And lots of your friends who decided CS wasn't for them might have been because they couldn't deal with the fact that they kept writing bugs. And they couldn't deal with that fact. But that's the thing. So, bottom line, there are going to be bugs in your code. Okay? All right, why are computers different in this sense? Well, computing is hard. I don't know if you figured that out yet, but computing is hard. I teach CS 107E, as some of you know, because you took it from me. And yesterday was the last lecture for that class. And I showed the class a little video about JFK's speech about going to the moon. Anybody know the famous phrase from that? We go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard, right? Computing is hard. And then I said, hyperbole aside, the reason you took CS 107 was not because it's easy, but it's hard. But anyway, a little bit of hyperbole there, I suppose, in terms of the difference. But point is, it's hard to make perfect applications. Okay, software is complex. Okay, we do lots of somewhat complex programs in our 106A, 106B, 107, it's 110, etc. But they're nowhere near as complex as an entire system. And this is the first thing you will realize. I know Frost has gone through this. You've written software that you've put in the real world. It's probably harder to get to that last part of making it work at the end so you're happy with it than anything else, right? It's complex, and that's the idea, right? That the things are, bugs are everywhere, or they're inevitable rather, and there's some other ideas here about like software systems are kind of chaotic. You make one change here and it affects something in the other part of the program that you don't necessarily expect. Try functional programming. That tends to limit things a little bit in that regard, but that's a different idea. And then the economics of software systems means that even flawed products can have tremendous economic value. In other words, you're still going to publish that buggy program because people will still buy it, and they might grumble when something breaks, but they're still going to use it. Right? Do you think Microsoft Word doesn't have any bugs left? Of course it does.
Video games.
Right? Video games. They have video games, a classic, right? But there's lots of software that does that. Now, Microsoft Word crashes on your computer, right? You're probably not going to like kill a small child. Like it's probably not going to happen, right? There are certain circumstances where bugs can be that. Speaking about economics for another minute, right? Economics, software economics are interesting. You don't have to put much work into producing software to distribute it, right? You have to like create it, but then distributing it's instant. It's on the internet, it's instant, right? Very low distribution costs. If the easier it is to distribute, the more people that use it, then the more like worth it is for you. And if there's lots and lots of people using it, then there's lots of opportunities for some of those bugs to be fine. And this is why some of you are in Stanford studying CS right now. Shortage of highly skilled labor. Programming is hard, and by the way, productivity varies a lot among software developers, right? You should sit there. There's another study that was done that said that the same people with the same level of expertise, right, can have variations of more than 20 to 1 in the types of problems they can solve, which means that if you're ever in a position where you're hiring people, try to do a good job, right? And it's hard to hire people because you never know, from a one-day interview, it's hard, right? I grumble all the time about students of mine who come and say, oh, I was sitting through 4 interviews to get an internship. I think that's kind of dumb. But I also know that companies realize it's hard to find very good people because of this variation, right? So, and then people have said, look, one top-notch engineer is worth 300 times more than the average. So if you can find that one person who's willing to stay at your company, pay them well, and give them lots of food and make them stay, to make them stay, right? Because you want them to like be there because they're so much more worth it than a lot of the average run-of-the-mill programmers. That's that. Okay, I gave you a handout. There is there's a handout here. Take the next 5 minutes, it's about a 5-minute read, to read about this Therac 25. I know a couple people have read it. Who's heard of this before? A couple people. Okay, read this little thing. Read this thing if you haven't heard about it, certainly. But we're going to talk about this machine in a couple minutes, and you can read the other one if you get done too. But this one's the one that I want you to read about the Therac. Boy, how many things went wrong on this thing? Right? This was not a good thing. What are your thoughts on this? The Clear Act 25. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's like really important that they mention like usability and and the fact that like, you know, it didn't require you to like re-enter commands, and it didn't have any sort of like verification that like what you entered is like what you wanted. And like I think that like a lot of times like usability and like user interface stuff is like often ignored when like thinking about these types of accidents. And I think that like in 3 Mile Island too, like this sort of thing like also happened where like, you know, like where like the user interface didn't show that like some settings were wrong or something like that, or it was like too difficult to use.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think there's a reason some of you guys have already heard about this in various classes. This can be used as an example in an ethics class. It can be used as an example in a mechanical engineering class for problems with mechanical engineering. It can be used in a computer science class. It can be used in an HCI class. It can be used. I mean, so many little things went wrong. Yeah.
One of the other things that reading about this too is that this was also a bug that was present in the old code base, but the safety features in the old machine prevented it from ever happening. So it's just like
they did
never tested this. You assume that everything was fine, but you never tested this with like the machines.
Yeah, testing probably wasn't done enough on this.
One thing I was surprised by is like they mentioned the users would ignore cryptic error messages like Mathmechanical before. I was wondering like shouldn't they have like a feedback system after the Mathmechanical is like it's supposed to do exactly what is.
Yeah, well, so part of it was probably training too. I mean, this is a machine that has the potential to kill somebody by doing something, like you could make it kill somebody. It's not like it's like falling over and killing somebody or something like, you know, it's like an accident. It's like you could actually program it to kill somebody, right? Yet they said that you can ignore these error messages, or a lot of people ignored the error messages because they got so complacent and it never happened before. So yeah, I mean, that was sure, malfunction 54 or whatever it was. Malfunction, not a very good error message, right? Not a very good error message. Yeah.
You said like, oh, maybe the new one wasn't tested more than enough, but it also is just surprising that it said that they had no test plan for their device that was formal at all.
Yeah, they didn't have any test plan for this.
Considering it got FDA approval, that was just really surprising.
Yeah. What year did they say this was?
80s.
80s. Yeah. So it wasn't ancient history, but it was probably before a lot of things. Yeah. These days you wouldn't be able to put this in a hospital. In the same way. Who else had their hand up over here? Yeah, go ahead.
So just kind of striking that, given that this happened once and I couldn't tell from the reading, but it doesn't seem that they invested enough to figure out what was going on, then allowed it to happen again.
Yeah, that's a huge. Now, this is I think where the ethical part comes into play a little bit. Look, you got this machine. It's obviously got some errors in it because you're getting these malfunctions. Yet they didn't stop the treatment. They kept going. They just restarted the machine and went on to the next person who they also killed, right, or whatever. And so I mean, like people died. Like you can. It's one thing to have a mistake, a bug that isn't found and that causes some problem, but then to ignore it is a huge ethical issue. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I found that with programming, any error, even if it's something that doesn't look like it's important, you should understand it. If you don't understand why it's happening, there's stuff going on, and you should just figure it out.
Yeah.
Because it's usually something.
It's usually something.
Yeah. Somewhere, and it's not going to kill someone if you're not building for it.
Right.
They didn't think that.
But yeah, and this sort of stuff they do now. You know, the other one was that they relied on software for something that could have been a hardware. Like it should have had a big switch on it that said we're going into high radiation mode, ka-chunk, all right? And then that's the hard to like break in software, but it didn't. It just was it got then the person pushing a button and then making a mistake going up and it didn't work. So yeah, this is I think the only good that came out of this was that maybe some people's worse they got their cancers stopped from it, but also we get this example that people will say, oh, let's never do that again.
Is there not like a cancel key or something on it?
There might have been. They did say that they said that when they had a problem, the user, the tech, just kind of went back and changed it. They didn't cancel the whole thing, part of it was that it also says I think it would have taken more time, and why take the time if it's not going to
just ignored all console
Well,
commands during.
let's not be too harsh on the technician. Too harsh.
No,
I
no,
mean,
no, I'm
you
not
know,
talking
but
about the technician. I'm talking.
oh, you're talking about the programmer.
I'm talking about the program.
Yeah,
Where
yeah,
it's just
yeah.
updating
Well,
the
right.
overall console commands during the magnet setting phase. Like, why are you going to
Well,
do that?
Right. I mean, you know, that's a good question. I think that's a good question. And this is why now, when you're building medical grade equipment, you have lots of other things to think about. And you've got mandated testing plans, and you've got quality assurance tests and so forth. So yeah, okay. So that's that one. Not a fun story. Here's another not so fun story. By the way, this is kind of they also talked about a race condition. If you've taken CS 110, you know all about race conditions, or CS 107E. This is kind of if in your program, two parts of your program that were running simultaneously had access to the variable x. This happens lots of times when you're doing parallel programming. By the time you get to this y equals x times 2, even though you got into this if statement here, by the time you get down to here, if that other part of the program changed x, then y is not definitely going to be 10, right? Now, if you're running a program that doesn't know about parallel programming, it would optimize a lot of this out, by the way. It would say, oh, great, well, if x equals 5, then y is just 10, right? It would just say that. But you have to think about these things. That was the kind of race condition that happened there that they hadn't figured out. So there you go. Okay, here's another one. I'm not going to make you read this one right now, but there's another little one-pager on this. The Patriot missile. Most of you guys probably don't remember. In fact, maybe only one or two of you remember the first Gulf War. I was in college then, to date myself. But the Patriot missile was a big... I was going to say, some people here do. But the Patriot missile was one of the missiles that was used to shoot down Iraqi Scud missiles. And it actually gets all in the news because it was so cool this thing worked and it could shoot down other missiles, and it was a big deal. Well, they ended up having a mishap with it that killed a bunch of people, a bunch of American soldiers, because the missile actually went off. And it was because, believe it or not, a floating point bug, right? And when we teach this in 107 and 107E, we talk about floating point. You got to be really careful, right? Turns out that there's a floating point error in here. If you try to do 0.1 in binary, 0.1 decimal in binary, it can't be represented exactly. Go try it out yourself, but it happens to be a repeating decimal. And they used a 24-bit register instead of a 32 or 64-bit. That was just what they had back then, the computers that were using there, that stored basically the expansion of this partially, because it can only store so many digits. And what would happen is they would have a timer on there that would increment every millisecond, I believe it said. And it would update this timer to be able to pinpoint the location of how far, I'll show you how far up and down the range was supposed to be and where you're supposed to shoot the missile. And it had to do this timer. What's that?
I think it was tenths of a second.
Tenths of a second.
Seconds was that they multiplied.
Oh, that's right. It was 10 because 0.1. It was tenths of a second. And it ended up because they had run this without turning it on and off for 100 hours, which was actually kind of abnormal, but it was a war. They did this 100 hours. It had a big enough mistake in the time that it actually aimed incorrectly and ended up killing Americans instead of shooting down these missiles, which is what it was supposed to do. That bug was not maliciously put there. That bug was not, they probably tested it, just, they didn't test it for 100 hours, obviously, but they tested it, whatever, and whoever programmed this hadn't thought about the fact that floating point numbers have this weird quirk where they're not exact and they're not, and it ends up with those sorts of issues. So that ended up being a bug. And again, ethically, should they have done? They should have tested it more. That's probably the biggest thing they could have done, or had better training on people who are writing these programs to know that that floating point numbers have this inherent problem. We can't be too harsh on them because it's hard to do. But that's a bug that there's bugs in all programs. Remember, not all, but all sufficient complexity, and this happened to be one of them that ended up causing something very bad. So that's an ethical problem that isn't because somebody was malicious, but just happens in computer science. Okay, now we get into some more malicious sorts of things, right? We talked about the Thompson hack the other day. We talked about Trojan horses in terms of, worms. I guess that was a worm. Viruses and worms are actually malicious. What do we do about malicious programmers? What can we do about them? Ethically, we have to kind of should think about them. What do you think? We just deal with it?
Well, now they're criminals.
They're criminals. Yeah, that's it. There you go. You bring in the law and you say, okay, if you get caught, you're in jail for 3 years or whatever, and that's kind of an important idea. Maybe better training. Maybe better, maybe the person who's the next virus writer's at some company that doesn't feed them all day, and I don't know, who knows? They're like upset, or better working conditions, better, don't work people for 18 hours straight, or pay them well, and lots of various things that you might want to think about when it comes to what we can do about that sort of thing. Any other comments on the malicious activities that are ethical in nature? I like that your answer is just they're criminals. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's good. I think it's right.
I don't know if that was always true.
No, it certainly wasn't always true. We had to write the laws to become those. And some companies or some countries, they're still not criminals to the extent that anybody can really punish them. Yeah, Zoe?
Could include like some safety parameters. That way, it's not as easy for most programmers to, like for security reasons.
Yeah. This is sure. You absolutely make your software systems, your operating systems, hardened to this sort of thing, and you try to make them so that it's harder to do. Now, it's a cat and mouse game. The more you make your program more secure, the more people will start looking and trying to figure out if they can break into it. And remember, it's gonna have bugs because it's sufficiently complex. And if you don't think Linux is complex, well, go look at the source code someday. It's pretty complex.
Hire them to do that for you.
What's that?
If you don't think Linux is complex, take 140.
Yeah, take 140, exactly. What was I think your comment was awesome.
To do that for you.
Hire them to do that for you. Yeah, there's a huge market for hiring hackers to go break into your system and tell you where all the bugs are, right? And actually, look, if your bent is towards breaking into stuff, go into that field. Why not? Don't do it. Don't write viruses and things because you'll go to jail. Go and market yourself as a hacker, a white hat hacker that's going to do hacking for good, and it's fun and it's cool, and you'll still you'll have a good time doing it. Okay. Anybody else on that? Yeah. Ben?
I'm just thinking. Okay, my first snarky thought is how do we define malicious? But the second thing I thought about was was it the Stuxnet virus?
Stuxnet, yeah.
Yeah. Now that ended up being actually carefully targeted to destroy the centrifuges that Iran's nuclear program was using. Is that correct?
That is correct.
From the perspective of someone in the Iranian government, that is definitely a malicious act.
Yeah.
So it's from the perspective of someone who, for whatever reason, doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear program, it's sort of like a pro-social act.
Yeah. So this I don't know if this is my next slide or very, very shortly after. Yes, it is my next slide. Okay. Right? Our government and other governments and so forth, we have to expect and demand certain things from them ethically, right? We like to think that, our government's got all these great ideas, but Ben just gave a great example of our government was responsible for creating a virus that ended up in the real world but didn't harm anybody's computer except the ones it was supposed to. But, well, I say our government, some government. I don't know if we know that it's our government, but some government, we think, mainly because it was so advanced, the virus, created a virus that targeted Iranian nuclear centrifuges to make them spin really, really fast and break. And it was delivered somehow to them, and it actually did, I think, break a lot of the centrifuges in that thing. And this was done, you could argue both sides of it. Ben would say, and I agree, that if you're the Iranian government, you say that is a malicious act, an act of terror, an act of maliciousness, etc. And if you're the side that wanted those nuclear centrifuges broken, you could say, well, part of our job, and it's ethically correct. So we have to think about those things when we talk about our government. And what are the problems with this? What's one thing that you have to do with the government that you don't necessarily have to do with other companies, let's say, especially as it relates to security? Anybody here work at a company where they have a security clearance? You ever work at you have nobody? Oh, interesting. So if you go to work for, maybe you can't say. You go work for company X, Y, and Z, maybe the 3-letter agencies or whatever. They're going to give you a security clearance, which means you're not allowed for the rest of your life to tell what you've worked at. And I worked at lots of places like that in the Navy and so forth. What's that?
I don't have that. It's just
It's an NDA. Yeah, NDA is similar, but I mean, like, security clearance, you're going to be put in jail if you start talking about that sort of stuff, right? Which means that you kind of have to trust the government, because there's lots of people out there doing stuff that you and I don't have any access to, because it's not like we can go ask about it. Hey, did you guys do this Stuxnet virus? No, they're not going to tell you that, right? It's all secret because they have to, like, then there's a trade-off, as with lots of other things, about you've got to trust them to do the right thing, and you've got to hopefully elect the right people who will have oversight, right? I mean, all those senators that do crazy things out there have oversight over this, and they are allowed to see some of these details. So you have to do that. But in the tech world, look, the NSA, the CIA, the Defense Department, all that, they have lots of technical things that have lots of the issues we already talked about, and they're doing things that you may or may not think is ethical, right? Which also, if I may step on my soapbox for one more minute, when you go work for a company or the government, you should probably think about where you stand as far as politically and as far as like ethically and so forth. Are you willing to work at a place that's forcing you to not talk about some of the things you do? Maybe, maybe not, whatever. But you should probably think about that. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. We have another part of the government, right? What about people like Edward Snowden? Right, Edward Snowden is now never ever in probably the rest of his life going to be let back in the United States. And if he is, he'll be probably put in jail for a long time. But he was a whistleblower, and he did know about some of these things that he believed were wrong, unethical or illegal or what have you. And he sent a bunch of data to the newspapers and reporters that was all about what the NSA in particular was doing with our data and what kinds of programs they had and so forth. And the question is, do we think that he's good or bad? And you can make that decision on your own, but you've got to think about those things, right? Like if you're ever working at a company or particularly the government, and you see something that's wrong, what do you do about it, right? Now, hopefully we have rules that will protect whistleblowers. He's kind of a special case in that, no, the things that he released were not whistleblower. He could have done it in a much different way, whether it would have had any effect or not. Like he could have been a whistleblower up his own chain. Right? And he could have said, this is wrong, and you guys are doing this wrong. And somebody up the chain could go, wow, we got to stop doing that. The odds that that happened is about 0, right? They would have gone up the chain, and he would have gone, well, sorry, we're doing it. Thanks for telling us, But he went a different path, and now banished from the country and a fugitive and so forth. So you have to ask yourself those questions. But they're ethical questions about our government and about people working for their government and so forth. So that's that. Here's another one. Remember this happened a few years ago? There was was it a bombing, or I think it might have been a bombing, or maybe a shooting, somebody shooting, whatever. It was a terror act of whatever, where somebody had an iPhone that was encrypted, and the police wanted to decrypt it, and they went to Apple and said, can you decrypt this? And they said, hell no. And they said, we're not going to do that. It's encrypted. And so they had to end up getting it cracked by some other team and whatever. But it went up in court, and people had to make decisions. I think they actually broke in before it made a difference. So I don't know if we ever got a definitive answer from the courts about whether Apple has to be able to do this. But it's a huge privacy and security and ethical kind of question. Does Apple have a back door to your phone? They claim they don't. They actually claim we can't break into that. We have no idea how to do that. Who knows? The government, some people want to force Apple and all the other phone operators to build a back door in for police. That's a huge ethical question. Yeah.
So I don't know fully how the technology works, but if, like, when Apple gives you the phone and they're like, oh, do you want to share your phone stuff with us to improve, like, your services or whatever? And for the most part, people are like, no, I don't want to. But say you said that I do want to do that. Since Apple now owns that data, because it's their stuff, and say the police were like, hey, Apple, we're, like, spinning you, we want this stuff. Since Apple owns that, are they allowed to give that to the...
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't know if they are or not. They probably are, but it's probably their company policy that says whether or not. Yeah.
So any data that's on Apple servers, they can give up in response to a warrant. Okay. So if the police go to Apple and say, like, we have a warrant, there's all this data on the server about this person, send it to us in a zip file or whatever, then they'll do that. But the issue here is that data was on the phone, and the phone was encrypted, and the FBI was asking Apple to make a special version of iOS, which they could install on the phone, which would be able to turn off the rate limiting of the passwords. Because you get the passwords wrong,
right, that's right.
Wait, like a certain amount of time. They want to be able to try all the passwords really fast.
Right.
And Apple said, like, this software could we give you this software and you're just saying you're going to use it on this one phone, but you could install it on any phone for any case, and like this could also get stolen from you, and then everybody would have it, and then all of our security is done.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They didn't want to give it up.
Yeah. Now, look, Apple made this into somewhat of a public relations thing too, and they, but a lot of people think they were doing the right thing, and they made a good point. They don't want, Apple wants you to trust them, right? Apple wants you to trust them to say that your phone is not going to be broken into, even by the police, because you're not going to do anything wrong. Whatever. But they want you to be able to. They would not give up that trust for anything, including going to court and fighting it out. So, but there's lots of ethical issues around tech and privacy that people need to think about in this world. Somebody who mentioned this, Anna mentioned this earlier, I think it was, about cameras everywhere. You mentioned that, or who else mentioned? Somebody else, I think you mentioned that. But anyway, there are more security cameras. Now, in the US, it's not quite as prevalent than it is in like Germany or England in particular. You go to England, like you are on camera 99% of the time when you're walking outside. There's a camera pointed at you, videoing you. And the British government will say, yeah, great, we cut down on crime and we can always find the criminals. And, that's a ethical question, right? I mean, there's a question about who's controlling that, first of all. The government is. Are they doing it in a way that is transparent and is open to see? I don't know. So big questions like that come out in the world like that. All right, and then this one, we also mentioned ethics and AI a little bit. Who saw this movie? Great movie. You should see it. It's a good movie. I think it's pretty. It makes you think. Anyway, but AI, right? We talked about this earlier with the trucks and the idea that AI is going to change a lot of things. And we also talked about, we have to worry about when we create AI that's really smart. We talked about the paperclip machine that, destroys the universe by making paperclips. And those are sorts of ethical issues that you have to consider when you're getting down to these sorts of things. So, guess what? Stanford is stepping up teaching of ethics in technology. There is your president right there, talking about that in an article in Financial Times magazine, talking about the various ways that you guys are going to have to take more ethics for classes and things, especially if you're teaching that. And then CS, if you go read this article, it talks about the CS 181 class, which is the ethics class that if you are a CS major, you have to take, or maybe one version, but you have to take that. And Mehran Sahami's in the article and talks about the new way they're doing the classes and so forth. People are thinking about this stuff, right? And all the big universities are thinking about it because they don't want to be caught teaching students not to make ethics important, because it's getting more important in the U.S. Okay, that's what I have. Any other comments on ethics? I don't mean to be a downer about it. It's a cool topic. And it is something that lots of people are thinking about and lots of companies are thinking about. And when you guys go out to companies, hopefully you'll think about, the types of programming you're doing or otherwise, however, wherever you end up, about whether or not you're upholding your part of the societal ethical picture. Yeah?
Just curious, when you said companies hire ethicists,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of technology companies, is that essentially people who are trained in engineering and stuff and then also trained in ethics, or is that more like philosophers and ethicists who were then slightly trained in technology?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, the question was, look, who are the ethicists that people are hiring, right? Can I get a degree in that? Yeah, sure, the philosopher. That's what all the philosophy majors are getting jobs doing this. It's a little bit of both. I mean, it's people who've been thinking about this. It's people who are working in companies that are thinking about that. And I'm not sure. It may also be people who've kind of worked their way up at a various company and ended up thinking about these things and just, ended up in that position. But yeah, Ben, you were gonna.
I know one specific person. I forget the name of his company. He's some AI company in Texas. His degree is in philosophy. He had a prior degree in math, and they hired him as a philosopher. So.
Yeah. As an ethicist or whatever, a lot of lawyers end up doing that sort of stuff too because they're trained in that sort of thought as well. But yeah. So if you want, start taking those philosophy classes. Any other comments? All right, we'll see you guys Thursday.